My name is Laura Maristani. I'm one of the VPs of the Space Industry Club, and I'm super excited to introduce our last panel of the day. This panel will explore the ways that our current human endeavors in space need to consider questions of maintaining long-term sustainability in the space environment. And I'll give you a sec. You good? Awesome. So without further ado, please help me welcome to the stage our moderator, Professor Daniel Wood of the MIT Media Lab and the Aerastro Department, Laura Cummings from Astroscale, Charlotte Chabarek from the MIT Lincoln Lab, and Alinda Mashiku from NASA Kara, and Marco Concha from Project Kuiper. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Eduardo. And thank to each of you. You are with us. We have arrived at the last panel of the last day of the 2023 MIT Space Week. Let's have a hand for 3 wonderful days of space gathering and dialogue. Thank you. And while we're clapping, I really want to appreciate and give a thank you to our sign language interpreters. Thank you for working hard today. We're so glad to be with you. I also want to start the panel with a land acknowledgement, because one of the reasons we're sitting here is to ask, whether on Earth or in space, in what ways are we receiving the heritage of past generations, and how are we going to leave our collective commons to future generations? So MIT acknowledges indigenous peoples as traditional stewards of the land and the enduring relationship that exists between them and their ancestral territory. The land on which MIT sits is unceded territory of the Wampanoag Nation, and we acknowledge the painful history of forced genocide and occupation of their territory. And we honor and respect the many diverse indigenous people linked to this land on which we gather for time immemorial. So thank you for taking that time with me. I am so pleased to be gathered with each of you. Several of you responded to an invitation from us to come, so thank you. Some of you responded to a recent invitation to come, which came due to changes of plans. So thank you for each being here from your different locations. I'm going to ask each of you to help us by introducing yourself further and telling us a few things, but first I'm going to set the stage a bit. So we are sitting here now with a key topic about the space environment. And we're here because we want to do so many innovative things that bring space in contact with society. And while doing that, we also need a new form of innovation to ask, how can we do everything in space without creating any waste? For students who are here, I beg of you to take on this challenge because it's going to take several generations to achieve, but we must do it. We must do it on Earth as well. But space might be a place where we can think about it in a nice, key way. Because as we know, it's an exciting time preparing for future space stations. We have a number of satellites going up, so many more than we've ever seen before, and the numbers aren't going to go down, they're going to keep increasing. And so this brings up lots of interesting questions. I was recently in Washington, D.C. at the American Association for the Advancement of Science meeting. I joined a panel with 3 astronomers who are eagerly asking how we protect radio astronomy and optical astronomy on Earth as we have more satellites operating with constellations. We also have the question of what it means in the future to have more forms of space traffic management. We don't quite have it today. We have some really important work by the US Space Force, including some folks in the room who represent the organization. We have the question of what does it mean to have the next generation of how countries operate across boundaries to share information about what's in space. Let's detect what's there. Let's identify who owns it and where it comes from and track where it's going, and then share that information in a way that helps us all coordinate. That's not quite in place the way we need it in the future yet. We also have the question of what kind of designs, what kind of life cycles, material choices, and even clever ways to have a whole new way of thinking about the beginning and middle and end of life of a spacecraft can we have to help avoid the creation of debris, avoid collisions, and avoid the question that we just trash our stuff at the end without a better suggestion of how to use it. We also have, of course, geopolitical questions. We won't cover all of them here, but there are realities that we create debris sometimes accidentally, and other times on purpose, through things like anti-satellite tests. These are all angles that affect what it means for us to have a sustainable space environment. And that's just in the low Earth orbit area, which we'll focus on today, but I'll leave us to say there's the next generation of questions as we operate beyond low Earth orbit, as we have more humans operating in low Earth orbit, and as people send activities eventually to places like Mars. In each new place, I want to ask the question again, when will we stop creating waste? Can we have a waste-free Mars community? Because if we do, our children's children will thank us, and they will think that we gave them the best blessing of a future way to live. So with that, I'd love to ask each of you to introduce yourselves. I'll invite Charlotte to go first. And what we've done is we've brought together many of the folks in the value chain for what it means to think about our low Earth orbit space environment and space sustainability more broadly. Sustainability can mean, in one way, how can we keep increasing our activities in space, but have safety and confidence we can do it in a safe way? But at a broader level, it also means, what does it mean to respect the cultural meanings of care for our environment, coming from generations past, indigenous communities, communities around the world? What does it mean to value the meaning of our natural environment in a deep way? But I'll ask each of you to ask, how do you define sustainability in your own job? And in what way is your responsibility helping us build up a more sustainable space future? So Charlotte, you can start.
Thank you, Danielle, and thank you to Eduardo for organizing today, and thank you to the audience for sticking around until almost 4 o'clock. So my name is Charlotte Shabarek. I use she, her pronouns. I'm principal staff at MIT Lincoln Laboratory. We're a federally funded research and development center. We are located in Lexington, Massachusetts on the Hanscom Air Force Base. We are administrated by MIT, and therefore we are all MIT employees and close to this community that we're here today. So I know not everybody's familiar with Lincoln Laboratory or federally funded research and development centers, so I'm just going to spend a moment explaining who we are, what our charter is, because it really does influence my understanding and interpretation of what space sustainability is. So MIT Lincoln Laboratory, we were originally part of MIT. We spun out of the RAD lab, the radiation lab. In World War II, we helped build the first Allied air defenses. In 1951, we became our own independent entity, and we created the air defenses that continue to protect our nation today. Our charter is national security, and we develop advanced technology to ensure safe country. So at Lincoln Laboratory, we don't often use the term space sustainability. We use different words, but what we're getting at is sort of the same notion. We are committed to ensuring safe, secure space operations for the global community, for today, and for future generations. And that's really where we're thinking sustainability. We want a space environment where all players can operate safely. So when I think about space sustainability through a national security lens, which is the charter of MIT Lincoln Laboratory, I think a lot about the satellites that we have on orbit that are protecting our nation. So if you think about the NOAA satellites that are doing weather forecasting, if you think about some of the NASA satellites that are doing a lot of science missions, or even our Earth imaging that is used for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, these are all technologies that are furthering our national security. I was actually really interested in Lydia's story about her kind of remote sensing work for agriculture, because that's also part of the work that we're in, making sure that those satellites can be safe so that we can check our food security. We can check for blights and droughts and all of those things that impact us as a global community. One area of our research is very focused on on-orbit asset protection. So we talked about a little bit about the NOAA satellites and such, but by NASA's estimates, I just want to let folks know that we anticipate that there is more orbital debris than active satellites currently on orbit. So that is not sustainable. And when there are so many objects on orbit that do not have maneuvering capabilities, particularly in LEO, when things are moving 17,000 miles an hour, there's a tremendous risk for collisions, which will then create additional orbital debris and just keep compounding the problem. And we actually saw this last week with the International Space Station, which is a human-crewed asset on orbit. And they actually had to maneuver because there was a remote sensing satellite that came a little too close. And every time one of these maneuvers has to happen, it comes at a tremendous cost. It includes spending fuel. And as we discussed, there's no gas stations on orbit at the moment. And so although the International Space Station is a little less sensitive to this, for other satellites, that is going to shorten their mission every time they have to spend fuel on an avoidance maneuver. So these are sort of some of the areas that we're working on in addressing space sustainability to ensure safe operations for the entire world, as well as for future generations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. I'm going to turn to Dr. Alinda Meshiku. I can add the doctor as we go down to various folks, but over to Alinda to say, what's a day in the life for you as somebody who's actively trying to protect some of our national scientific satellites, and tell us about your work at NASA CARA.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Wood, and thanks for having me here. Super good to be back at Boston, Cambridge rather, Massachusetts. So I'm the CARA program manager. CARA stands for Conjunction, Assessment, Risk Analysis. And pretty much what my team does in a nutshell, we make sure that the NASA satellites, those that are non-human crewed, so without the astronauts, that kind of work is supported by the folks at Johnson Space Center. So, but at NASA Goddard, our group, the CARA program, we make sure that the non-human crewed spacecraft do not collide with each other or any other space object in space, in low Earth orbit, as well as in GEO. So the CARA program was started about 15 years ago, almost like 15 years ago, or about 20 years ago, and the number of satellites that we support has grown. You know, we started initially with 4 missions, the ones that were in the A train performing the CA conjunction assessment for them, and now we're up to about 76 operational satellites. The kind of work that we do, we work with missions at the pre-launch phase. We interact with them, we engage with them, we understand what their science mission goals are, where are they going, what do they plan to do, how long do they plan to stay, are they maneuverable, are they not maneuverable, what is their CA CONOPS, right? And so there's a lot of work that we do at the beginning, and then once they launch and they're in orbit, we provide that day-to-day support, making sure that we track them, we provide them with notifications at least 7 days before this time of closest approach, and that is the time where a satellite is in a place where we call it's a high interest event where you could potentially end up colliding with another object. And so, in a nutshell, that is the kind of work that we do. And so what does space sustainability mean? And what does that look like in our day-to-day work? So for me personally, in my opinion, what that means to me is making sure that we can maintain the continual use of space as a finite resource to provide benefit to our society, while also maintaining, our space environment, keeping it safe, maintaining or even actually improving our space environment. And so if you Google online, what does sustainability mean? There are like 4 C's of sustainability or the 3 P's of sustainability. I liked the 3 P's definition. And, first is, profit, right? You want to, profit means many things to different people. It could mean, making money. It could mean, returning the science value of the science missions that, NASA does and other commercial entities do. The second P is people, the people actually doing the work and the people impacted by this profit, by this benefit. And the third P is place, environment, space environment, Earth, Moon, Mars, etc. And so with all of that, to summarize, how do we make sure that we're keeping all of this in mind? We want to maximize benefit, everybody does, but also keeping in mind who are we affecting, how are we affecting, and maintaining the space environment. And so, as I mentioned earlier, our support and our efforts to make sure that we endeavor this is broken in 2 ways: pre-launch support, pre-launch analysis, and post-launch support. And so we have 2 documentations or 2 kind of procedures. One is the collision avoidance plan document, the orbital collision avoidance plan, the OCAP document. And so we reach out to missions really early on during pre-phase A, like they proposed their mission, they got awarded, yay, we're doing this, it's happening. So we talk to them, where are you going? What are you gonna do? What is your spacecraft bus size? Orbit plans, who's your launch provider? Are you maneuverable? Are you not? We think about things like light pollution, how large is your spacecraft, your, photometric capabilities? Are you trackable? With CubeSats, which is really good, low cost, high ROI, it is great, but which altitude are you going to? Can we see you? Can we track you so that you don't end up conjuncting or colliding with another object? And then so many other things that we do from that standpoint, that once they launch, we maintain an interface with each and every mission. We get data from them, we call it the orbit ephemeris data, which is their state information, their covariance data, and we screen that daily. Before a mission maneuvers, we make sure that your planned maneuver does not end up conjuncting with another object and then you inadvertently collide with another object and so forth. So it's a lot of things that we do, and I'll stop there.
Thank you. We'll come back to you later and hear more about the innovations your team's working on. I'd love to go to Marco next, Marco Concha. In your role as a flight dynamics lead at the project Kuiper and Amazon, you are aiming to operate a large constellation and bring into everyday life what it means to have your team and other teams with you be sustainable. Please tell us about your definition of sustainability.
Thank you. I'll start off by saying Marco Concha, Project Kuiper, Flight Dynamics Engineering Lead. Kuiper is a low Earth orbit constellation telecommunications mission to provide broadband internet to everyone in the world. We've targeted something like 95% of the human population with the orbit selection and constellation design that we have. 3,236 satellites is what we filed for, what we intend to fly. It's a new thing for a lot of folks. It's not something that everyone has done, certainly with some exceptions. And it brings a lot of challenges that I think are being brought here. I spent 17 years at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center learning the craft that Alinda spoke about. We have a lot of that capability internally. We've built a very, very capable team. And to design from the very beginning, this is space sustainability concerns that are being brought to bear. I think something we've seen over the last few years is an increased awareness in industry that you just can't throw something up there without there being consequences. You certainly can't throw dozens or hundreds or thousands without there being consequences, because even if you had a wonderful solution, if you're not communicating that to the general community, you're just creating doubt and mistrust, perhaps, until you prove yourself. At Amazon, we like to earn trust. We like to serve our customers first, and working backwards from what we think our customers need. That's what the whole genesis of this mission is to provide something that's, I think, really needed for Amazon and its customers to serve, and also for other reasons. Space sustainability to me is the preservation of a working, viable space economy. Okay, so I think it's a noble and necessary goal to say leave no trash, no garbage, and as you stated before, I think that's a noble and serious goal to aspire to. We're not there, and we certainly won't get there anytime soon. I'm from the Pacific Northwest currently, originally from Washington D.C. But if you grow around, if you're walking through the 200-foot trees, and a very big tenet there is leave no trace, right? And so it's something that in Redmond, Washington, really resonates with how we do things at Kuiper. And I'll speak more of that about what we're trying to do there. Thanks.
Thank you. Before I leave you, can you just give the audience, for me who may not be following the weekly space news, what's the current status of your project so they can have a sense of what you share publicly?
Well, if you're going to give me that platform, all right, let's go. Thank you. We have 2 protoflight satellites that are slated to launch aboard the maiden flight of ULA's Vulcan. That's slated to be in a few months, I think in May. So stay tuned. We'll have 2 satellites as secondary payload. Primary payload is going to the moon. So it's a very high-profile situation, and we hope for the best.
Thank you for that tidbit. Appreciate that. All right, we're going to turn. So what we've been doing, we started with a piece that does research and development, helps the government build capabilities to understand what's happening and keep satellites safe. We went straight to a government employee who's keeping government satellites safe that serve the whole world with data about the environment. We went to a company who's going to move us to a new level of satellite operations. And now we'll go to a different type of player in the ecosystem. I'd love to invite you, Laura, to speak first from Astroscale. What does space sustainability mean to you, and what are your responsibilities in your companies in this area?
Perfect. Well, thank you for having me, Dr. Wood, and thank you, MIT, as well. Obviously, I am not Jack. He had a late-breaking responsibility to attend to, so I am here in his place. But yes, my name is Laura Cummings. I am the Regulatory Affairs Counsel for Astroscale US. So while I work for the US entity of Astroscale, we are actually a global corporation. We have sister entities in the UK, Japan, and our US company owns an Israeli subsidiary as well. And so to the definition of what space sustainability means to us. So Astroscale's vision is actually the safe and sustainable use of space for the benefit of future generations. And recalling 3rd grade when my teacher yelled at me for using the word to define the word, breaking that down a little bit and including, you can see it in our name, so Astro Space, scale for balance. So really what we are trying to do in pursuing sustainability is balance the current operations and the current benefits really that accumulate from the use of space. As we mentioned, agriculture. My brother works in the agriculture field, so very near and dear to my heart, with also preserving the space environment for future generations to use and enjoy. And you can really see this through how we are acting and what we see as our responsibility in reaching that sustainable space goal. So Astroscale has 3 pillars. 2 of those are technology and business cases. So recently here in the US, Astroscale US is now a supporting contracting partner of a US Space Force contract award to Cislunar Industries, where the US government has essentially awarded funds to look at the possibility of putting forgeries, so melting metal, in space. And Astroscale's part in this is to look at the possibility to retrieve objects that are debris and potentially able to be melted into fuel rods. And then once those fuel rods are created, take them to a client object. And so that is both a case of the technology to actually do rendezvous proximity and operations and docking, as well as looking at that business case there of can you create that circular economy and start advancing the circular economy in space. And the last thing that we do to advance sustainable space and our responsibility, and really more what I kind of do day to day, is support global policy development. One good example of this, and again, going back to that balance concept, is here in the US, we are advocating for a regulation that would look at the aggregate probability of collision of non-maneuverable satellites in a multi-satellite constellation. So let's say you launch 10 satellites, and for some happenstance on orbit, 2 of those can no longer maneuver. Those 2 now have a probability of collision aggregated that trips a threshold, and the government tells you, okay, we're gonna pause this for a bit. We're gonna look at why this is occurring, what improvements you can do to decrease that risk threshold, and move forward from there. So a recognition that you want to encourage people to launch multi-satellite constellations. They have really cool applications returning into agriculture, Earth imaging, communications as well, but also balancing that business case against a potential risk to the orbital environment. And so that's how we are pursuing space sustainability.
Thank you for that summary. I'm going to try to ask, if I say it correctly, that Astroscale wants to prove that you can make money trying to remove space debris. Is that true?
Correct, yeah, so that's one of the kind of unique business cases that no one has really proven before, and so you see different markets that develop for this. I'm gonna pretend I'm Jack, put on my business development hat. So in low Earth orbit, one of the main commercial markets that you see is for what we call end-of-life services. So if you have a multi-satellite constellation, and they're all flying close together in their orbital shells. Generally, you design those that they would deorbit themselves if there were a failure. But let's say for some reason that doesn't occur. Now you have a dead object that is not only creating risk for your own satellites, but the other satellites around it. An end-of-life service is then feasibly purchased by that commercial operator to protect their own constellation as well as the environment. And we would rendezvous with that non-maneuverable object and remove it to a lower altitude where it would demise. The other business case in low Earth orbit is actually active debris removal. So think about your really large space objects. So one example is derelict upper stages of rocket bodies. Out of Astroscale Japan, and actually funded by the Japanese government, they are working on a mission to, the first step is to inspect an upper stage rocket body, characterize its tumble rate, can we actually dock with this thing? And then there will be a second award to actually remove the object. And so in those cases, it's really kind of a government funding at that point, because a lot of those large objects are the government's from Cold War launches, stuff like that. And so that's kind of the other business case in LEO. We have one in GEO as well that's life extension, relocation, maneuvering around, but we're in a LEO panel, so I'll stop there for now.
Thank you so much. As you're noting, we can just pause and appreciate examples of other countries doing things the US isn't doing. We have in Japan and the European context projects that are funding experiments to demonstrate active debris removal, which we are not quite seeing in the same way in the US.
Yeah, we do see the UK also has funded a mission called COSMIC, which Astroscale UK is supporting, and that will remove 2 defunct British satellites in low Earth orbit by 2026 is the goal. And in the US, we're making steps. They did last year introduce a piece of legislation called the Orbits Act, which calls for the US to characterize essentially the 50 most probable objects in low Earth orbit and fund those as allocations are available for active debris removal. That was reintroduced, I believe, 5 days ago. So we're working towards it, but call your Congress people. It's something that we should definitely get a move on.
Thank you. In the time we have left, I'm going to invite each of you to do rapid fire responses to a few key questions. I got some great ideas from our organizers. These are student-driven questions as we go. Some will be serving our aspiring innovators and entrepreneurs in the audience, and some will be highlighting the engineers to ask how they can do technology innovations. As I start, I'll reflect on my experience in the last few years working on a project with Mitu, who's here, called the Space Sustainability Rating. It's now live and active as a nonprofit based in Switzerland, and there exists a way that an organization can apply and pay a fee to get rated according to a number of metrics about how they're trying to reduce space debris in their mission, both in the early stages, like the planning you mentioned, Alinda, as well as during operations and end of life. So there are indeed a list of actions that any space operator can do, choosing their materials, choosing their orbit, choosing the number of satellites. All of those affect how much space debris risk they create for collisions, and also their impact on astronomy, for example, and on the dark and quiet skies. I want to ask each of you, in your own responsibilities, what innovations are you working on or are you seeing that you're excited about? Because this could easily be a discouraging panel, but I want to hear the positive things that you're either looking forward to or you're grappling as new challenges. For those who want to answer, what innovations are you seeing or are you hoping for?
I'll go first.
Michael, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Like I mentioned earlier that from the very beginning, we incorporated in our design what we thought is important in terms of space sustainability. For us, that's a very sort of localized problem. If we have a system that creates debris in the same area that we're going to be operating satellites, that creates a hazard for us. So one example of what I'm talking about is our propulsion tank. Our propulsion tank, MIT grad designed it. Can sustain a direct hit from large 2 centimeter, 3 centimeter object, which will puncture a propulsion tank. Pressurized vessel that's punctured typically creates a lot of splintering, a lot of debris. We've designed a system that absorbs it and does not, and so that's one example, something I can speak about publicly. Another thing that we're working towards in terms of handling this space sustainability issue is coordination, communication with other satellite constellation operators. If this audience doesn't understand it, when United States Space Command, which operates the Space Surveillance Network, catalogs all objects in space, either they're little pieces of debris or operating satellites, and they predict in the future where they're going to be. Alinda's team does this too in terms of screening and evaluating. But those trajectories are then predicted, and when something a close approach within a certain threshold is discovered, a conjunction data message is produced. That's sort of an alert given to industry. There's an infrastructure required for you to participate into that system, and then what do you do with that data? Now, if you're NASA, you have Kara to manage that for you. If you're smart like Kuiper, then we know how to do it too. Is every operator so well equipped? And I think when constellations versus constellation becomes a real traffic problem, the frequency of the CDM generated, whereas legacy systems like EOS Aquaterra had 7, 8, 10 of these incidents per year to handle. Per year. So the alert comes in, a bunch of spreadsheets are drawn up, some PowerPoint slides, a meeting's convened, humans in the loop go, yeah, that's great. Smart decisions are made. That's not scalable, right? If we're going to be encountering thousands of these CDMs per day. I can't pick up the phone and call Starlink 36 times an hour. What we have to have in place is real, what alludes to space traffic management, a system where their system and my system can communicate. We agree ahead of time how we're going to handle things. We have the necessary information in that CDM, not quite there, and then we move forward with a contract-based or a system-based transaction that's automatic and safe. That's got to be transparent and vetted, and everyone else can observe to see, well, because I don't want to ever be in space news. This engineer said that this, and some other body said something else. That does happen. It does happen. The stakes are very, very high. And Amazon is a very high-profile organization that has to do things the right way to earn trust from the customer.
There were so many pieces there. There's the information exchange. There's just among the major players, but there's also the players who aren't necessarily, like you said, that have the strong teams. There's also the ability for the autonomy on the satellites to react. These are all innovation areas that are active right now. Others want to respond?
Yes, definitely. So, I agree with everything that you said, Marco. We're doing a lot of different research topics or areas within the CARA program, but I guess I can only mention a few. I'll talk about the autonomous CA. So, when you're launching a large number of satellites where you have this constellation, it is untenable to have a human in the loop, as you mentioned. So, if you have one system, one constellation performing autonomous CA and the secondary object that is conjuncting with, it is easy for the primary owner to just go ahead and perform the collision avoidance maneuver. But then how would you communicate with a secondary object that probably, also is a part of another large constellation? So what you end up having is autonomous CA and autonomous CA CONUPS conjuncting with another autonomous CA CONUPS. And then how the whole CA process works, as Marco talked about, is that, the entire space catalog is managed by the 18th Space Defense Squadron in California, the whole DoD group there. And so the ground systems team, or the whole interaction on the ground, is key and has been the main way or the main process that we do CA. So how do we work towards shifting and implementing this autonomous CA process, in space? And so there's a lot of work that our team is working with other large constellation groups, trying to determine a mechanism where you can share and exchange data between an autonomous CA setup constellation with another one, but then also thinking of ways how you can incorporate other data from the entire space catalog. Right now, there's about 26,000 space objects that are currently tracked and screened 3 times a day for low Earth orbit and about 1 or 2 times a day in GEO. So it's a lot of data, and you need coordination so that not one object decides to maneuver in this direction and the other one decides to move in the other direction. You can end up, conjunct with another object if you don't perform screening. So screenings are really, really important. So one big area to determine how can you implement that. From a mathematical, technical perspective, it's very straightforward-ish, right? It's like station keeping. But then there's the process piece of it, there's the systems piece of it, there's the data handling piece of it, all of that. And so there are many ways that we can continue to look into to make that a reality. I'll mention 2 other areas that our team is performing research and, thinking about ways to continue, maintaining this, space environment sustainability. And one of them is light pollution. We have a large body of astronomers at NASA Goddard, doing all the cool science work. Everybody wants to look up, or even when you're in space, you also kind of want to look outwards as well. And so how do we continue to support commercial endeavors, having them, launching these large constellations, but then also making sure that astronomy is not impacted by that. And so our team has performed research and analyses to, engage the community to determine what are these thresholds, acceptable thresholds, that can still support the astronomy community so they can continue doing the cool science, looking up at the stars and doing all the cool stuff that astronomers do. And then one last thing I'll talk about in terms of research, this is not necessarily my CARA group, but then I'll talk about NASA Goddard as a whole, is the whole OSAM, mission or program. OSAM starts for on-orbit satellite assembly and manufacturing. And so one of the early goals for this mission is to perform a tech demo, going up to space and seeing, can you rendezvous with another object and perform refueling, missions so you can extend the life and the use of a satellite that's already on orbit. But then there are also future endeavors whereby, if you can do that, performing the physics and the engineering to determine matching rates and, can you use that same technology to deorbit defunct satellites that are up in LEO and have them passivate easily as well. So a lot of things, we know the problems, it's pretty much identifying what they are and addressing it from different vantage points. And so coming up with recommendations and sharing that with the broader community. So thanks.
That was really helpful. It also elucidated for those who may be not following this field, these different parts of the life cycle. There are sensors on the ground, radars and telescopes that are operated by both government and private entities now. What we're missing on the panel is somebody from a company, some of the companies that are active in monitoring what's happening and providing new commercial data, like Leo Labs, for example, that's selling data to the government and adding to this catalog of data. This is a new trend. They're kind of missing as a ghost here on the panel, so I'll mention them. So we have questions of how to combine government and commercial data about what's happening in space, questions about how to coordinate among satellite operators and then between public and private operators, and of course across countries. So just to lay out all the interesting technology areas. And then so I want to ask for more examples of innovation. As you give them, please also include advice to people interested in creating businesses. We're in the business school, so for the students who want to be entrepreneurs in this area, highlight the innovation opportunities, but also suggest if you're recommending to one of these folks to start a company, which area can they take it in? More ideas.
Great. So thanks for that suggestion. So let me just build on something Alinda talked about with sort of autonomy and opportunity space there. So space is valued at, what is it, like I have the number written down somewhere, but it's $469 billion or something enormous. So the opportunity space is very large for entrepreneurs looking to break in. I see a lot of opportunity in autonomy as well. And at MIT Lincoln Laboratory, we actually pioneered a lot of the safety standards around air traffic control. And I often lament that it is so easy for us now at this point in time, looking back at some of the work that was done in the 70s, when we were putting transponders on airplanes to know where they are at each point in time, where there was some autonomy in which if two aircraft come within a certain specified amount of space of one another, there's alerting, there's rerouting, all of this is happening autonomously. And I keep hoping and wishing and dreaming that we can, in the space community, start to replicate that, acknowledging that the orbits and the physics and the challenges of communication is much more difficult in space. So that's an area that we've been thinking about a lot. As far as advice for entrepreneurs, I think that one challenge, no matter what startup you're looking to get into, is where does the money going to come from? So identifying your business model. So particular for space sustainability, there's a lot of interest in building critical infrastructure on orbit, and we've kind of talked about some of the interesting work that other panelists are doing in this area. But I think one thing that's worth noting, and I think Laura actually kind of got at it a little bit, is who's willing to pay for that? Who's willing to pay for orbital debris cleanup? Is it satellite owner operators? Is it the governments? Is it some civil agency? Is it an international cooperation? And the question is, the answer is I don't know, because each one of those entities is a stakeholder within this. So, think about the business model, think about the return on investment. Also consider factors like launch is getting so easy and so cheap. So and the way the economics are, it's easier to launch something new than repairing something that's on orbit, but that's not really sustainable. So these are sort of the factors that I would consider, questions I would ask myself if I was getting into this field.
I'd love to hear from you, Laura. And one of the lessons I take from working on the space sustainability rating is that there's a number of choices that can be made by operators, and operators have some freedom right now about whether they'll make some of these choices. Many of them are not optional. And I do some of my own academic advertising of going to United Nations events, speaking to Congress and saying, government, you could use this list and you could require companies to do some of these activities. And of course, there's a conversation happening. But please, in your role as somebody who speaks directly with companies and with governments, please comment on both the innovations and the opportunities.
Yeah, so on the innovations, and I think picking up on this theme of communication that a lot of people have touched on, one group that I specifically want to mention is CONFERS, which stands for the Consortium for the Execution of On-Orbit Rendezvous and Servicing. So this is a group of actually international commercial entities that is designed around communication, really, and standardization of things that will advance on-orbit servicing. So some of the work that they do is talking about refueling interfaces. So imagine you go to a gas station. It would be really hard if everybody had a different type of gas tank in their car. Nobody could get gas, or only like 5% of you could get gas. And so some of the work is talking about how to standardize those interfaces. They also do work around communication and standardization of operational models, as well as a lexicon. So if you're speaking to each other internationally or even governments, it's really important that you all have words that mean the same thing, because otherwise you're going to run into problems. And in a very technical and evolving sphere, that's one of kind of the baselines, is make sure you use the same words. But then also, and this brings in some of the tracking and the ground station providers and the collision avoidance actually, is there will be times in servicing when you want to bring together two objects intentionally. And you need some way to coordinate or to communicate to governments that I'm doing this on purpose, this is okay, this is for commercial purposes. And you need some way to communicate to people who are providing your space situational awareness services that, yes, these two things are together. Thank you for sending me these collision avoidance messages, but maybe pause them for right now. We're doing this intentionally. And so Confers is really a sphere where people can gather and participate and then publish things like that. And so that's one of the kind of inventions and advancements there. And on the advice for people, that would really be, and this is putting my regulatory hat back on, pay attention to regulations. One of the things that I've heard from our business development folks is that investors are aware of the regulations that you will run into in the space industry, and they will ask you questions about them. One of the things that Astroscale is seeing and that the Federal Communications Commission has started to recognize is one of the major sticking points for in-space servicing, assembly, and manufacturing is going to be access to spectrum. We have defined ways for people who are providing internet from space to provide that service. But in terms of bringing two objects together, there's no clear regulatory pathway to get that spectrum. The Department of State maybe has some rules around making sure that you have coordination between governments if this is an international mission, but those are also things that we will need to develop. And so pay attention to your regulations, know where there are gaps, and know where you will need to watch as things continue to evolve.
Okay, thank you so much. We're coming to the end of time, and I'll just encourage you to ask questions as we move into the session later for relaxation and for chatting. But I'll ask everyone to close with one sentence. Try really hard to do one sentence. I want to ask you, what's one thing you hope to achieve or change in the next 2 years or so that you think will advance space sustainability? What's a responsibility your team can take on in the next 2 years? I'm going to start with Marco. One sentence, we're out of time.
Improving and demonstrating the interoperability between large constellations to demonstrate that industry does care about sustainability. That's it.
Thank you. One sentence.
Actively working to share the NASA lessons learned through the NASA Best Practices Handbook, summarizing conjunction assessment and collision avoidance best practices.
Thank you. Let's see that.
Continuing to support our Department of Defense and international partners and civil partners in space sustainability.
Identifying mechanisms for spectrum access and authorization, as well as international approval of international servicing missions.
Thank you. And my last sentence will be challenging students to help us eliminate waste. Thank you all so much. Let's celebrate the end of our Space Week panels.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our panels for today. We want to give a big thank you to our panelists here and throughout the day. Round of applause, please. Also, on behalf of the Space Industry Club here at MIT Sloan, we want to give a big thank you to our sponsors who made this day possible. And lastly, we also want to give a big thank you to our staff and support services here at MIT who made this run so smoothly. And round of applause, please. So that concludes the New Space Age Conference. We really look forward to you coming back next year. And on a logistics note, we just want to note that right after this, from 5 to 7, is a networking reception. We'll have beer and wine and hors d'oeuvres. And please make sure you have your wristband to show. Yeah, that's about it. So thank you so much. We'll see y'all next year. Thanks.